A majestic Boeing 777 rolling down a taxiway at a major airport is hardly a new sight. But soon you might see one with a new feature. It will be taxiing with its wingtips folded. Then, just as it enters the runway and prepares for takeoff, those tips will unfold and show the new 777 in all its glory. This is the Boeing 777X, the newest chapter of a story which started with one revolutionary twin jet who quietly started replacing the old tri- and quad jets. And since the chapter of the original passenger version of the 777 has recently ended, I thought that it was appropriate to tell its story. The Boeing 777 became, after its introduction, basically the default long-haul machine, seen at airports like London, LAX, JFK and even in some smaller airports. It was so successful that it all but ended the reign of the Queen of the Skies, the mighty Boeing 747. And as if that wasn't enough, the 777 also opened up new routes and brought down the cost of flying. So, how did it do that? And what can the new 777X, with its fancier wings, smarter aerodynamics and even more ludicrously large engines, add to the mix? Well, we have made several videos on this channel looking at the troubles and delays of Boeing's 777X. So it wasn't maybe so surprising that Bloomberg and other news outlets announced early in October that the 777X is now facing even more delays. Now, Boeing really do seem to be getting their ducks back in a row lately, but even before this latest announcement, we knew that Boeing likely wouldn't be able to get this new plane certified before the end of 2025. What the October news added was that even if the 777X finally gets certified in 2026, deliveries to the airlines probably still won't start before 2027, possibly even the second half of 2027 according to some analysts. And those delays are a real shame, because they take away some of the shine of an aircraft design that really isn't as appreciated as it should be. So let's together now roll back the clock to the late 1980s. Boeing were making the Boeing 737, 747, 757 and 767, but that lineup had an obvious gap, which Boeing actually had failed to fill once already. The Boeing 767 could cross the North Atlantic and connect big airport hubs with smaller cities, but it couldn't really cross truly large distances. Then, in the bigger range, the mighty Boeing 747 could fly basically any route and transport massive amounts of passengers between hubs, but it also cost a ton of money to fly. So the airlines wanted something to fill that space between the 767 and the 747, a plane with the range to do the same routes as the Queen of the Sky could, but perhaps a bit smaller in order to cover routes with a bit less demand. Initially, Boeing tried to use a smaller 747 to do this, the Boeing 747 SP, which we've covered in a previous video. And this was basically a shorter version of the early 747-100 and 200 for super long routes with less demand. But that aircraft still had the problems associated with using 4 engines, meaning that its economics didn't really make sense on most routes. So it was doomed to remain as a niche aircraft. Now, what Boeing really needed was something revolutionary. And for a short while they actually considered giving the future 777 3 engines, in a very similar layout to the Douglas DC-10 or the MD-11. But that thankfully didn't get very far. What Boeing did instead was quite unusual for the time. They brought together the potential airline customers and invited them into the design process. And they did this from a very early point in the conceptual phase of the project. United, ANA, British Airways, Lufthansa and a handful of other all got the invite. And it turns out that they had a lot to say. To be clear here, this wasn't kind of a focus group. No, Boeing was asking for real design input. And the strategy formed part of the same kind of working together attitude that the company had towards their employees back then. A very different kind of Boeing from the company that we've come to know more recently. Anyway, it soon turned out that what the airlines wanted wasn't a 4 or 3 engine jet. They wanted what Boeing and actually Airbus also had already showed could be done with the Boeing 767 and the Airbus A300. A bigger twin jet. One with seats for around 300 people, able to carry a substantial load of belly cargo, and that would also be able to cross oceans with the same confidence as a 4-engine jet. Oh, and they also needed this new plane to fit into the existing smaller gates, of course. Now, Boeing took all of these requirements and just ran with them. From day one, the 777 was treated as a clean sheet project, so everything about it would be built from scratch and would therefore include a lot of innovations. For example, it was the first airliner to be designed entirely on a computer, which allowed the teams to assemble the airplane on a computer screen and therefore fix issues months or even years before anyone pressed any real sheet metal.
We have not put the knowledge that's in the airplane designer's head into artificial intelligence that balances all these objectives. Someday, we'll continue to probably move to that end, but
it was also going to be Boeing's first fully fly-by-wire aircraft, a technology that added flight protections that they had never seen or had before. And even more crucially, Boeing also worked with regulators to broaden the rules for ETOPS, or Extended Twin Engine Operations Performance Standards, which restricted how long twin-engine planes were allowed to fly away from an airport, so effectively from land. Now, I've gone into ETOPS before, but the point here is that the 777 was the first aircraft to enter service with 3-hour ETOPS approval. A truly massive change in the industry. For the first time, a twin jet could make a trouble-free trip connecting cities across oceans, and the implications of this were big, as we're soon going to see. Now, when we are on the topic of seeing things, have you ever noticed the floating pen that I have over there on my desk? Well, if you've been following my channel for a while, you would have seen that it sits there in every one of my videos, and that's for a really good reason. Wait, I'll go and get it. This is the hover pen from Novium, and it's not a gimmick. It's just some really cool engineering which I love. This version, the hover pen Interstellar, won Time's award for the best innovation of 2022, and it's made from aircraft-grade aluminium and sits at exactly 23.5 degrees, completely aligned with the Earth's actual tilt. It comes in 4 different colors: black, red, silver or blue, and there's even a premium version with an actual meteorite fragment embedded in its shaft, likely older than the Earth itself. But if fountain pens are more your style, or you just like a little bit of more drama, well then the hover pen Future is probably more to your taste. This one leans at an extreme 60-degree angle, and it comes with interchangeable tips and is available in 3 colors: black, silver and blue. Both Interstellar and Future are refillable and are delivered in gorgeous packaging, making them a perfect gift for anyone who appreciates great design or a conversation starter. I'm thinking of you, Dom. For Black Friday, you can get 20% off your order as well as worldwide shipping, their best deal of the year. But it's only available for the next 48 hours, so scan this QR code, click on the link in the description and use the code MENTORNOW at checkout to get it. Thank you Novium for sponsoring this video. Now let's get back to the story. The very first Boeing 777 rolled out from its hangar on April the 9th, 1994 in a spectacular ceremony. And thanks to Boeing's then new computers and design tools, that prototype was already less of a prototype and more of a production airliner. 2 months later, on June the 12th, the enormous twin lifted off for its maiden flight, and the test team began the unglamorous essential test work: flutter runs, stalls, engine out drills and crosswinds. Box after box was soon ticked, with no major hiccups recorded. Certification from the FAA and other authorities came already the following spring, and the launch customer, United, then took the first delivery of a shiny new Boeing 777-200 on May the 15th, 1995. This meant that the gap from the first discussions with airlines to this first delivery had taken just over 5 years. An absolutely unthinkable time frame these days. Oh, and by the way, United still flies that first 777, November 774 Uniform Alpha, to this day. Anyway, there wasn't much grandstanding after this plane entered service. Just a simple wide-body going to work. But the incredible development timeline still mattered because it told an important story. Rollout, first flight, certification, entry into service, and an on-time delivery of a bold new promise. Boeing was basically a company to be counted with. The type then quickly became the new default for long-haul travel, and once the airplane had proven itself, Boeing didn't waste any time. They immediately started creating a whole family around this new core idea. First came more fuel and more seats. The 200ER, or extended range model, which added the extreme range that the airlines were asking for. And later, the stretched 300 variant also added extra capacity for really busy trunk routes. After that came the pivot that really changed fleets, the mighty Boeing 777-300ER. It sported new and even more efficient engines, plus even more available gross weight. The early 777-200 had not been big or rangy enough to fully replace the Boeing 747s, but the 300ER now got really close to what most 747 operators really needed. So this plane could finally slot in where jumbos used to live and also do the job cheaper, day after day. Big routes that used to be dominated by 747s, like Los Angeles to Sydney or London to Mumbai, now instead quietly became the bread and butter routes for this mighty new twin. And for even longer routes, Boeing soon also introduced the 200LR, or long range, which they called the World Liner. This jet would allow airlines to schedule crazy long non-stop routes that would break records, like Atlanta to Johannesburg or Auckland to Doha. Now, the 200LR wasn't Boeing's biggest seller, but it was the base for the 777's second, less glamorous career: cargo. To be clear here, even a passenger 777 variant could be loaded with highly profitable belly cargo without having to make any sacrifices on range. And because of that, these jets would often end up with a healthy belly of containers, whilst still making the fuel numbers that they had promised, and that turned previously marginal city pairs into honest year-round lines of business for the airlines that were using them. Exactly the kind of versatility that the airlines absolutely love. When the dedicated 777 freighter then arrived, carriers like FedEx took that same range and efficiency and turned it into an overnight intercontinental conveyor belt. And for airlines that did both passengers and cargo operations, the whole 777 family needed only one pilot type rating, one maintenance and spare supply chain, and 2 revenue streams. So it soon basically took over the long-haul world, simply by making the numbers work without any particular drama. Sure, it was still a little bit smaller than a Boeing 747, but thanks to those twin-engine economics, its size allowed schedulers to improve flight frequency instead of gambling on only a few big departures. And that's exactly what the airline soon did, even with bread and butter city pairs. British Airways replaced a single jumbo to New York with multiple 777s crossing the Atlantic every day, and Air France did the very same thing out of Paris over towards Washington DC. This basically meant the same gates, same ground gear, but more options for passengers and steadier revenue for the airline. The economics were undeniable, and crucially, the plane's size meant that the route and ticket fare equation also worked in the relatively slow winter season, not just for summer holidays. That's actually why Cathay Pacific leaned into the 777-300ER on Hong Kong to New York and Hong Kong to Toronto, for example. But just as importantly, the 777's size and economics also opened up routes between even smaller destinations. Suddenly, a city that wasn't a global mega-hub like Phoenix, Glasgow or Shenzhen could justify a non-stop long-haul route without having to pray for peak season loads. So this meant that more dots on the map could suddenly be connected directly, without midnight stops along the way. Now, previously in history, a lot of new entry planes had fallen flat on their initial promises, but the 777 was actually doing all what Boeing had said that it would, as its dispatch reliability figures soon clearly showed. On top of this, pilots seemed to really love how this aircraft flew, which is obviously super important. And passengers also seemed to like it, especially early on when 9 abreast seating in economy cabins was the norm. Sadly today, 10 abreast in a 343 configuration seem to have become more popular, with the airlines at least. But still, by all accounts, the Boeing 777 was a relatively quiet and comfortable aircraft with a ride that felt nice and calm, useful for long 12-hour legs. And if we put all of this together, you'll understand why this aircraft ultimately came to define a lot of airlines. But maybe one airline in particular, which is where we start to return to the newer model, the 777X, and its biggest airline customer, Emirates. Even today, the tall gear, big engines and raked wingtips of the 777-300ERs parked side by side define Dubai's international airport. And Emirates has now built a global hub based on this aircraft, stitching Dubai to secondary cities and megacities alike using the same formula. Long legs, plenty of belly cargo, premium cabins, and trip costs that a jumbo just can't touch. Now, of course, Emirates also likes the Airbus A380, and they have the network to also make that plane work, but with the 777-300ER, their schedulers can add frequency to a lot more destinations when the high capacity of the Airbus A380 just isn't needed. But something that sits between the 777-300ER and the Airbus A380 in size probably wouldn't hurt, right? Also, despite its success, there are still some airlines that kept flying the 747s long after most operators gave it up, at least for passenger use. And therefore, Boeing found themselves with an interesting challenge. Replace the few remaining 747s with an even bigger 777 and replace the existing 777 fleet, which is now beginning to age a little bit. That is a tall order for such a successful and honestly still pretty new aircraft design. And what they came up with was the 777X. The idea here was to give airlines an aircraft similar to the jet that they already knew, but nicer, newer and more fuel efficient. And at the same time keep the same pilot type rating, the same supply chains for parts and maintenance, basically a seamless transition in other words. In simple terms, the Boeing 777X is a re-winged and re-engined version of the previous aircraft. The wing is very light, and thanks to those folding wingtips, it gets a much higher aspect ratio, which helps with reducing drag. Now, this aircraft's complex geometry is only possible thanks to the modern composite wings that the Boeing 787 first pioneered more than a decade ago now. And the folding wingtips means that it will still fit into the same gates as the original 777, and therefore won't need the ultra-wide and expensive gates demanded by the Airbus A380. Those wingtips, by the way, might look small, but the plane's size is playing you a trick there, because each folding wingtip is actually around 11 feet or 3.35 meters long. That's crazy. Anyway, then comes the next news with this type. Under the wings hang the new GE9X turbofan, which is the biggest jet engine ever fitted to a civilian airliner. It has higher pressure ratios than the GE90 that it replaces, with modern materials and even better control systems inside, who lets it operate more seat miles using the same amount of jet fuel. But getting to those new numbers hasn't been exactly tidy. In the summer of 2019, General Electric found durability issues in the GE9X's high-pressure compressor and therefore pulled back the engines for a redesign of its stator assemblies. This meant that the plane's first flight slipped from 2019 into January the 25th, 2020, when the first 777-9 finally lifted off out of Payne Field. But even before that, there was other issues on the airframe side as well. During the September 2019 ultimate load ground test, a cargo door reportedly failed, so Boeing paused its testing, investigated it, and then had to reinforce the plane's structure. The regulators also needed to do their own homework, since folding wingtips are a completely new feature for airliners, the FAA issued special conditions, like demanding that Boeing prove that the tips stayed where they should in 65 knot gusts, prove that crosswind handling was good on the ground with the tips raised, and also prove that all possible failure modes would be benign. After the 737 MAX crashes, the process to certify new aircraft obviously got much more complicated. And as far as the 777X was concerned, by June of 2021, the FAA told Boeing to not count on a near-term approval, and the program's timeline was subsequently delayed again. Reports also noted a 2020 test flight uncommanded pitch event that demanded flight control software refinement, which after the MCAS incident was exactly the sort of thing that the regulators were really looking out for. And then of course came the part nobody had planned for. The pandemic, supplier knots and the slow boil of getting paperwork, test points and fixes to line up at the same time. Airlines pushed deliveries and reshuffled fleets, whilst Boeing kept flight testing, closing findings and working through redesigned parts. But no matter what they did, the schedules have just kept slipping since then, and the order book for the new 777X now looks a lot slimmer than the one that its parents used to have. But here comes the twist in this odyssey. The reason that the 777X doesn't have a broader appeal isn't really competition from Airbus. Instead, it's competition from Boeing's own lineup. You see, while demand for a slightly bigger 777 is undeniably out there, demand for something a bit smaller is even bigger. The Boeing 787 has been a smash hit since it first flew back in 2008. And that's because it basically took the same twin-engine logic that the 777 had and shrank the risk. Lower trip costs, lighter airframe and a really comfortable cabin, plus its smaller size meant that connecting secondary cities now became even easier. Pick 2 dots on the globe and there's a good chance that a 787 can draw a line between them. The 787 also didn't just open up new routes, it changed the way that planners thought about them. Instead of asking, can we fill a 350-seater every day? The question became, can we profit with 260 to 300 seats reliably year-round? Again, it's the year-round part that people often forget. And you can actually see this in the fleet plans. The 777-200 was the first to be impacted when the 787-9 slid into those missions with better fuel burn and friendlier trip costs. It allowed the airlines to slowly start sending those smaller 777s off to the desert. Even on routes where a 777 would still work when full, the 787 made the math work with even smaller numbers of passengers. And that's why you'll find the Dreamliner wearing the house colors of legacy carriers and startups alike. Everyone likes an airplane that lets you say yes to a long-haul market without betting the farm on it. And now Airbus is of course doing the very same with their Airbus A350. So where does this leave the 777X then? Well, actually, exactly where it was aimed in the first place. The trunk routes that actually need 380 to 420 seats and real cargo at airports like Dubai, where slots are gold and frequency isn't the answer. But the everyday growth of long haul, the secondary cities, the niche pairs, the seasonal swings, well, that's now the 787's territory. So to summarize here, the original 777 didn't win with a spectacle. It won with maths and reliability. Something that the 787 is also now doing. It arrived, did the long legs without drama, carried real cargo without flinching, and let airlines build schedules that actually worked. And the 777X is the heir to that job. Its history so far has been, well, a little bit messy for sure, but if it delivers, it should become the right answer for those trunk routes where the seats are full and the slots are scarce. And I really hope it will, because it is a fantastic aircraft, one that really echoes of Boeing's true glory days. But what do you think? Will the 777X be a hit? Let me know in the comments below, or join my Patreon crew by scanning this QR code to tell me your thoughts directly and also help us to create these type of videos. My name is Peter Hörnfeldt and you're watching Mentor Now. Have an absolutely fantastic day and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.